Education is a perennial election issue. It's not a stretch to say it's been a major factor in determining the outcome of past races. That's why it's been a bit surprising how little it seems to have been a feature in this campaign, particularly given the school shutdowns and serious disruption to learning due to COVID-19. So let's give it some attention now. With us in Östersker, Sweden, Tony Pontes, Executive Director at CODE, the Council of Ontario Directors of Education. In Paris, France, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, Assistant Professor, Wilfrid Laurier University, and Visiting Scholar at UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. And back here in the provincial capital in Seton Village, Annie Kidder, Executive Director and founder of People for Education. And on the Danforth, Caroline Alphonso, Education Reporter for the Globe and Mail. And we are delighted to welcome all four of you back to our program, and from such exotic locations. The Danforth, Seton Village. Wow, that's pretty exciting. Anyways, that's my lame attempt at humor. And just before we start our discussion, in the interest of full disclosure, let me remind everyone that TVO is a provider of the province's distance and online learning, not the agenda, not the journalism part of the organization, but another part called the ILC, the Independent Learning Centre, which has been a distance learning partner with the Ministry of Education for almost 100 years. Let's get into this, everybody. We want to just show, first of all, we're going to talk teachers. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring the first graphic up and talk about what the four major parties have on offer as it relates to teachers. The PC platform, as you may well remember, is the budget. And there's no mention of teachers in the provincial budget, no mention of hiring more or fewer. The Liberals talk about hiring 10,000 more teachers for schools across the province. The NDP would hire 20,000 teachers and educational workers. And the Greens have nothing specific about hiring more teachers in their plan. Let's start at first principles here. Annie Kidder, do we need more teachers in our school system?
Yes, absolutely. We survey all the principals in the province every year. And in this last year, I think, and the year before, the number one challenge issue they named was staff. Lack of staff, lack of access to staff, teachers and support staff, supply teachers when teachers are absent. So it is a huge issue in Ontario schools and in schools actually across the country.
Kelly, as you look at the four major party platforms, is there much to choose from here if, in fact, we do need more teachers in the system?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that the NDP highlights both teachers and other education workers, because I think that one of the things we're learning is that there's a whole team required for students to get that more wraparound support that we hear more and more about when we think about student well-being. And I also think it's really important to remember to divide by 5,000. That's how many schools we have in Ontario. So even 20,000 teachers, it's 4 new teachers a school on average. So it's not as monumental as it sounds.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up for Tony, because, I mean, presumably somehow somebody somewhere does some research to come up with numbers like 10,000 or 20,000. Do you know if those are, either one of them, the right numbers in terms of what we need more of?
Well, I'll first of all start by saying that education relies on teachers and education workers. And the more of them that you have, the more individual and focused support you're going to be able to provide children and young adults. However, I think the question is not, do we need more teachers and more education workers? That's a simple answer. Yes, we do. The question is, where will they come from? Because right now, we're in a desperate shortage of teachers and education workers. So I think that the parties need to be talking with education stakeholders about how we generate more teachers now and into the long term.
Can I just do a quick follow with you on that, Tony? I mean, presumably we have, we've got a few dozen post-secondary institutions in this province that are presumably pumping out more teachers, more teacher grads every year. Is that not a steady supply from which we could take?
When you look at how many are leaving the profession, both retiring and simply changing their careers, it is not enough. And that's absolutely clear. There are not enough new teachers being introduced through the faculties of education. The other area where I think we're lacking is in certifying and looking at different ways and better ways to certify internationally trained teachers. I think those are the two major pools for teachers, and both of them need some restructuring. We currently have a 2-year program for teacher education. I'm not I'm not sure that that is the best plan right now. And if we continue with a 2-year plan, we should probably be looking at the second year being a paid internship where they add to the complement of teachers.
Okay, Caroline, let's get you in here. As you look at the competing platforms on offer, what strikes you about them?
I think one of the things to remember, Steve, is the previous Liberal government changed the teacher education programs to go from 1 year to 2 years. This was to curb the number of teachers entering the school system. So now we're in a position where, we've seen over the past 2 years, boards are fighting for supply teachers to fill in classrooms, and they're using other education workers to fill that supply shortage. So, clearly, we need more teachers in the system. Clearly, as Tony pointed out, there's a number of teachers that are going to be retiring over the next 5 to 10 years. How you get those teachers will be the issue at hand. We currently have shortages in French programming, for example, and other specialized programming for teachers. And, we're competing with other provinces at the moment to get those teachers in the system. So what is the action plan here in order to attract more teachers? I haven't heard much of that.
Annie, I'm not necessarily asking you to be a Monday morning quarterback here, but the requirement that the previous government brought in, as Caroline suggests, to go from 1 to 2 years of training in order to become a teacher, in hindsight, was that a mistake?
Well, yes, probably in hindsight, but that part's easy. I think that everybody's right that more the question is, how are we ensuring that teaching is a really attractive profession? How do we? Tony's in Scandinavia, in Finland, it's like the most sought after profession there is. So how do we ensure that it's very, very attractive to come into? We do need to look at the teaching program, but we also need to not just think about how long is it, but actually what the quality is and what we are teaching. And I think that Tony's also right that we have to look at how we're qualifying people coming into the country. But most importantly, I think we have to think about that profession. And it's not just a numbers game then. We have to understand what more is needed to ensure that we're getting lots and lots and lots of qualified candidates, and especially lots of diverse candidates, so that we have a teaching profession that reflects the students that are in the system.
Kelly, as you look at what's on offer from the 4 major parties, do you see something glaringly missing that you think that they have not put in the window that they should have?
Well, the thing that is least prominent across all the parties is any mention of the sort of highlighted crisis around equity that the pandemic has only underlined. The NDP does actually talk about equity. They're about the only one. All of the proposals from all the parties seem to me to be based on all students have the same needs across the board, and very, very little effort to sort of re-envision the education program. So we don't hear about things like tutoring. We don't hear about things like finding new ways of getting support into schools, maybe getting teachers a little more time to prepare by having young people doing sports leadership and getting kids moving. There's just not a lot of equity or rebuilding. And it's not entirely surprising that you don't hear a lot about equity in an election, which is essentially a popularity contest. But when we think about the sort of challenges we've faced in our school system, the fact that equity is not in the conversation is really depressing.
Caroline, let me put the same question to you. What, as you've looked at the campaigns and what they have on offer, what are they not talking about that they should be talking about?
I want to build on Kelly's point. One of the things that we've experienced over the past year is tremendous upheaval in the education system. I have 2 children attending public school, and they've been home with me for periods of time and stretches in school. And what we're not hearing, yes, they're adding more teachers into the system. They're talking about class sizes, but I haven't seen any sort of strategic plan on how to mitigate those disruptions, on how to mitigate those learning gaps that children experienced over the past 2 years, especially in Kelly's saying, in communities where they experience more disruption than other communities. And we haven't heard any sort of concrete examples on how we're going to help, especially some of those youngest learners, recover from 2 years of disruptions. Like a grade 3 student right now, Steve, their first full year of school was back in senior kindergarten. So that's grade 1 and 2, which are very formative years in learning to read and write and do the sort of those basic sort of social skills. They have not had 2 good years of that. So what is being done now to help those students? And I haven't heard anything around that.
Interesting. All right, let's move on to issue 2 here, and that is class size. And that may have something to do, actually, with some of the issues we've been discussing already. The Progressive Conservatives, no change to the current class size caps. The Liberals say if they form government after Thursday that they would cap class sizes at 20 in every grade. For the New Democrats, they would cap grades 4 to 8 at 24 and kindergarten at 26. And for the Greens, they would cap 4 to 8 at 24 and kindergarten at 26 as well. Tony, why don't you start us off on this round? What do you like here?
Sure. Well, I like the fact that parties are looking at smaller class sizes. It's just simple arithmetic that if a teacher has fewer children in their class, they'll be able to provide them with more individualized instruction and support, particularly for those neediest students in the class. However, the concern I have is that no one has talked about how they will consult with the education sector to implement that, nor how they might provide some flexibility. By that I mean, right now we currently have class cap sizes of 20 to 1 in grades 1, 2, and 3 for 90% of the classes. The other 10% of the classes are allowed to move between 20 and 23, still with a maximum of 23. The reason that works is because if you capped every class in grade 2, for instance, across the board at 20 to 1, what would happen in a school where there were 23 grade 2s? 21 grade 2s. You'd have to have a class of 20 and then a split grade class. What would happen on November the 12th if you had a class of 20 and another student moved into the school from an outside area? You'd have to reorganize the school. So I love the idea of smaller class sizes because kids will get much more support. However, it's important that whoever the government is of the day, that they consult with the education sector. And this actually ties to something that Annie has been talking about for quite a while, and that's an advisory body. We can talk about that later. But it's important that there be some flexibility on that cap. If it's an absolute cap, I can tell you that it will be nothing but headaches and turmoil and disruption.
Well, Annie, I mean, that is the trick, isn't it? Because to say we're going to cap class sizes at 20 sounds like a vote winner until you realize that the details, as Tony's just enunciated them, are a lot more complicated. So have these parties really thought through these promises?
Well, it is. And it's funny because a long time ago, when People for Education was younger, we advocated for hard caps on class sizes too. And then we had to change our minds because everything Tony just said is correct. So it's a hugely expensive thing. And you have to think about how to make sure you're really getting the class sizes you want and not kind of creating way more problems than you meant to create. And I think I'd like to bring up here de-streaming. So last year in high schools in Ontario, or this year we're just finishing, we de-streamed grade 9 math. And we did look at whether or not there were smaller class sizes offered because we know that there were going to be a lot of challenges in this new program. And we were surprised to see that there were actually more likely to be smaller class sizes in high income areas than low income ones. But be that as it may, come the fall, all grade 9 classes will be de-streamed. So I think the thing to think about is the targeting, is where do you really need this and for what purpose, and how are you making sure then, because de-streaming was, one principal described it as he said he'd been teaching for 25 years, I think, and it was the worst implementation of new curriculum we'd ever seen. We need to make sure we're setting that up for success. It's incredibly important. So if I were, king of the world, I would be targeting those small class sizes based on need, because we know the research tells us that's where you can see the biggest difference. That's it for me.
If you were going to be king of the world, Annie, what would your title be? I guess we should play this through. King Annie the First?
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. You
Okay,
know,
we'll go with that.
it's so easy from the outside. Yes.
All right, so Kelly, follow up on that if you would. I mean, hard caps as a political promise during an election campaign sound very sexy. The devil's in the details. Do they understand what the details are here?
Well, I mean, class size caps won Dalton McGuinty an election really a long time ago now, 15 years. And so it's not entirely surprising that parties are going back to something popular that both parents and educators deeply, deeply value. It is also something really expensive. So, you know, there remains somewhat mixed evidence on whether small classes lead to better outcomes, although, of course, we only measure the narrowest possible outcomes with test scores in a few subjects. I feel like it's not a very creative approach to thinking about how do we reinvent our school system. I feel like there's room to think through. If we were going to really spend those billions of dollars, is that the best thing we can do? And is that where we'd want to do it? So it kind of circles back to Annie's point around targeting and really thinking through what we're doing. An across-the-board solution that sounds like something for everyone, I'm not sure that's what our Ontario education system needs right now.
Caroline, I'm not sure I've ever interviewed an education expert who has said, if I had $2 billion burning a hole in my pocket, the first thing I'd do with it is ensure that we got smaller class sizes. They say that is not the priority. What are you hearing in your reporting on this class cap size issue?
I mean, I think, like the other guests have mentioned, it's a lovely idea. Parents want it, educators want it. Just like the issue with teachers, I just don't understand, or what I'm hearing is I don't understand how it's going to work. I remember during the pandemic when the TDSB, for example, wanted to lower class sizes in communities. They didn't have the space to do that within their schools. And I remember a document where they had to go to the Ontario Science Centre, for example, to request the classroom space that they have in order to accommodate smaller classes. So while it's a lovely idea to reduce class sizes, and we've seen those caps in grades 1 to 3, I just don't understand the Liberal promise where you're going to cap 20 across the system, or even the NDP's promise where you're going to cap it. I don't understand where the space is going to come from or materialize from. I don't understand where the teachers are going to come from to do that. And the research is mixed. I mean, as Kelly said, it's a very narrow research evidence base where you're looking at assessments. And during this time, kids are going to need more than anything. They're going to need sort of, emotional support and mental support and behavioral developmental support. So class sizes would be ideal. But maybe a targeted approach to class sizes would be a better way of recovering after these 2 years. Maybe sort of the neediest communities need smaller classes like the TDSB did during the pandemic. That would be an ideal way to go about it, but I haven't heard sort of any concrete plans yet again on how they're going to go about it. Gotcha. Let's move on to issue 3 here, and we want to talk about the 4 letters that strike fear into the hearts of every grade 3, 6, and 9er in this province, and those letters are EQAO, Education Quality and Accountability Office. Go ahead, Sheldon, let's bring this up. The PCs are vowing to bring the EQAO testing back this year. The Liberals would end the EQAO testing and replace it with a new assessment strategy. The New Democrats also want to end the EQAO testing and introduce random sampling. And the Greens have on offer just ending EQAO. Okay, this thing is always so controversial, but Kelly, why don't you start us off this time? What do you think about what 3 of the 4 parties have got on offer here? 3 of them want to end it.
Well, I think we do need system-level data on student achievement and outcomes, and that goes well beyond tests in a few subjects. So I'm certainly more interested in hearing from the folks who want to rethink the education data strategy in Ontario. I think we really do need a big rethink. EQAO is coming on 35, 40 years old, and what we need out of our schools has changed a lot. And the dissatisfaction with EQAO has never gone away. So there's not a lot of buy-in for that data from the education community. And I certainly think we do need ongoing, timely data on achievement, including in literacy and numeracy. And I think it's a really, really big problem that the Conservative government canceled all assessment through the pandemic. So we have less data on how our kids are doing than almost anywhere else in the world, along with our exceptionally long school closures. But I certainly think the time for a rethink is now.
Tony, what's your view on it?
I like Kelly's thought, which is that a rethink or a review of where provincial assessments fit into government policy and what is really needed to help guide our schools and our kids. I think that some assessment is important, but I don't want to forget about all of the authentic assessment that happens every day in schools. So if you want to know, if mom and dad want to know how little Tony is doing, they have a wonderful teacher with lots of assessment, formative assessment and summative assessment that will tell them how Tony is doing and also informs the teacher in terms of how they should program for his learning. If we want to know how the system is doing, I suspect some form of random sampling could do what we would be looking at. And many countries have moved towards random sampling. EQAO, their budget is only about $30 million, which in the overall scheme of things is not huge. So this isn't a money issue. This is a matter of perhaps giving us the information we want, which is generally how is the curriculum being learned across the province. We don't need to have individual students assessed every year. The other thing I would say is that the focus on assessment for every student, let's say in grade 3, 6, is that an unintended consequence is that institutes like the Fraser Institute use it to rank schools. That was never the intent, nor should it be the intent. And real estate agents use it to rank schools and to somehow sell houses within the borders of a good school. That was never the intent of the provincial assessment. So I think those unintended consequences would be removed if we move towards a random sampling.
Annie, what's your take?
It's too bad we're just all going to keep agreeing on everything. I think that I think it's important to remember it's called the Education Quality and Accountability Office. So EQAO doesn't stand for the test. It stands for, supposedly, which we could quibble about, an arm's length office that has the capacity to think about assessment, overall provincial assessment. So I would argue not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, but definitely, as Kelly said, a rethink, definitely, as Tony said, looking at sampling. That's how PISA works. We believe that from all over the world. We do sampling in Canada when we compare provinces. You don't need, it's just like polls in an election. You don't, every single person doesn't have to participate to understand where the sort of general success is. I think it's also important that we understand all the different sort of layers of assessment that happens. And we've been looking at what provinces and territories are doing across the country in terms of looking at the impact of the pandemic. And some provinces are doing a lot more interesting stuff or putting more into the mix when they're trying to understand the overall impact. They're looking at, kids' report cards, they're looking at student surveys, and in some cases, and at standardized tests. But again, we've got this office. Let's repurpose it so that we have really great research about what's going on in our system. And for me, especially in all of this, not just now, but into the future, because we've got to be able to hold both those things in our minds. Yes, recovery. What about renewal? What about going forward?
Caroline, the clock has caught up with me here, and therefore I'm going to deprive you of the opportunity to comment on this, but I'm going to ask you to comment on what I think is the big overarching question of this campaign, which is the almost complete, apparent lack of voter interest in education issues as reflected in the public opinion surveys. We hear housing, we hear affordability, to a lesser extent climate change. Education is not cracking the top 3 or 4 or 5 issues in this campaign, despite what the last 2 years have provided. Why do you think that is?
That's such a great question, Steve, and I wish I had a good answer to that. Maybe everyone's just tired. That's what I can come up with. If you remember before the pandemic, we had teacher negotiations led into work to rule and teacher strikes. Those contracts were only signed in March and April 2020, just as the pandemic was was washing over Canadian shores here. So I think, people have just gone through one set of upheaval after another in education. And, coming out of this election, teacher contracts and education worker contracts are expiring at the end of August. So we're going to have another round of negotiations in front of us. So perhaps, people are exhausted. That's all I have.
That's not bad, actually. Okay, Annie, what are your antennae tell you about why this has just not been a big campaign issue at all?
Well, beyond that, it's really depressing that it isn't. I think that it tells us something, and maybe Caroline's right, we're all just tired of everything. I'm not sure how engaged people are in the election, in fact. But I think what it tells us is, and what we have to remember, is that education itself has kind of isolated itself from the world. So people who care about education have not done a good job connecting education to all of those other issues, to jobs, like making that clear link between jobs and education, between health and education. Education is the number one determinant of health, but we're not very good at making that clear. So I think it should be a wake-up call to all of us who care about public education to do more and better in terms of a communication strategy, laying the groundwork to say that public education is actually probably the foundation of all of these other issues of democracy, of citizen engagement, of a thriving economy. But we definitely haven't done that right now. So it's really easy for everybody to see education as an issue for teachers and for parents. And why should I care? I don't have kids in school.
That's a kind of a sad
Sorry.
conclusion, but yeah, I take your. Both of you made very strong points about that. Well, let's see if things change after Thursday and we get a government in place and onward we go. I want to thank all four of you for coming onto our program tonight and sharing your views. Annie Kidder, Tony Pontes, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, Caroline Alphonso. Be well, everybody, and we'll see you again down the road.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.